Good morning, everyone. Do you hear me? I want to welcome everybody and thank you for coming today in this beautiful morning. So I'm just gonna tell you what I'm gonna be talking about today as Wissam is setting up the presentation. Well, I'll be talking about scientific methodology and what it is and what it is not. I'll be offering somehow, I would say, counterintuitive view of what we know about science. You know, the science we know and the methodology we learn is actually what schools teach us, the way they present the story of science. So today I'll be presenting a view that I will call based in evolutionary epistemology, based on the idea that as a species, we are actually limited by our own brains and nervous system and by our interactions with the environment. And thus science is a reflection of this interaction. So, thank you. So let me just begin by saying what were some of the earlier definitions of science. You know, based on some ideas, science is known to be cumulative. You know, it's like a collection of facts and new findings. It's a progressive progress. It's something that's marching towards something that's gonna, not completely, but eventually approach what's real out there, you know? It's like what the evolutionary idea that human beings are the pinnacle of evolution and that we are at the top of everything. Thus, our science reflects this view of ourselves. Even though we became more scientific, we still look at ourselves as the pinnacle of, not creation, but evolution maybe. Also, science is an inductive process. The idea collecting of facts and observation and adding them together where you induce theories that approximates reality. This theory, or this idea of science is based on what is called empirical realism. Empirical realism is a defining feature of real science. That's what we've been told. You know, and I'll explain what's that in a second. Empiricism means that all knowledge is based on sense experience. The idea that we have our senses and we actually use these senses to interact with what's out there, with what's real out there. The world is completely objective and our senses help us collect data or information. Empiricism is also a reflection of realism. Realism is a philosophy of science that asserts that objective knowledge exists and that this knowledge is mind independent, so that people who are collecting this knowledge and working toward this knowledge can be completely objective, can be completely outside the effects of history and the context and their times, their financial situation, economic situation, and they should strive toward that, toward the progress of science. And I'm going to say in a second what's problematic in this view of science and what is a new evolution and neuroscience telling us about science. Now, all of this led to what a lot of you who went to school learned about the falsification view of science. The idea that Popper actually has a philosopher of science, famous one, looked at science and the history of science and came up with the idea. And mainly, it's called the falsification of methodology. What it means is that scientific knowledge and theories are characterized by predictions that future observations will help us decide if they are true or wrong. Popper said in one of his famous papers that you could never prove a theory correct, but you can disprove a theory. So the idea came is that we can actually collect more data, collect more sense observations, and disprove a theory. And those theories or data should be empirical, should be sense data. So our eyes, our vision, our hearing, you know, our touch, all of these are involved in the senses and how we collect data. Also, as I said, the scientific theory cannot prove but be disproved. He said that it must be possible for a scientific system to be refuted by experience. A theory that is not refutable by any conceivable event is non-scientific. Now that's what we know, that's what we think is science is. But if we look carefully at the history of science, and if we look carefully at what has been done by famous scientists, scientists who were creative, who actually opened our horizon and our mind to things that we never could have imagined, from Einstein to quantum physics, we could see that this idea that senses and that only if we can refute a theory is actually problematic. And I'll say this in a second. So, what is the problems with this falsification method? It said that theory should be subjected to the judgment of experience, because experience is the most reliable we have. Our senses are reliable. Well, we know our experience can be mistaken because senses are not fallible, actually are not infallible, actually can deceive us. We know this from many tricks we show it in introductory psychology classes, where we show you things in terms of perception, and the brain can easily be perceived, and it will be clear in a second why the brain is easily misperceived. So senses, in a technical way, they're not completely infallible. Actually, they can mislead us, and they've done many times. Look at the people who claim that they've seen UFOs, or people who claim that they've seen ghosts. Senses are not completely infallible. They actually get us in trouble sometimes. Empiricism, also, the problem of it is that assumes the purity of the observer. Objective observers, right? You are not related to your context, to your history, to the historical era you live in. You are, and should be, as a scientist, completely pure from any subjectivity, from any, secondary gains you might have. But we know now that's not true. Scientists have a lot of things that affect them: personal gains, subjectivity, historical era, and more importantly, we know from quantum physics that our interaction with any phenomena changes the phenomena we're trying to study. We are not outside any phenomena in science or even in social science. And thus came the idea that observational reports, when we report something and report these facts, constitute the empirical basis against which theories must be measured. Only observations and sense data can give us a solid account of what's happening. Now, I don't know if I can still hear me? So I'm going to give you an example from science and why this will illustrate that senses can be actually fallible. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the tower argument. Back in the day, Aristotle, thousands of years ago, decided against the theory that the Earth actually moves. We know that the Earth actually moves around its axis. He said, how could that be? He said, imagine that we have a tower and you drop a ball or a subject. He said that if the Earth is moving, the ball that falls from the tower should have moved some distance because the Earth is moving. Hence, the ball actually falls right away down the tower, the Earth doesn't move. So, here we have our sense data is showing us that the ball actually falls down. At a time, there was no gravitational theory. Galileo, who is considered, I think mistakenly, the father of empiricism, came and said, well, wait a minute. You're just saying that since the ball falls down, the Earth is not moving. You're just making a fallacy by assuming the Earth isn't moving. I think if you change the view, change the theory, you can actually change the observation. And that's actually, if you read his book, it was clear what Galileo said. He said that, well, I assume that there are two forces here at play. The force that is vertical, that we see. This force we don't share, or this movement, we don't share with the stone or with whatever subject, so we see it. But there's also a curvilinear, a curved movement we don't see because we share it with the Earth and the tower. Imagine yourself in a plane. You and the one sitting next to you are moving at 1,000, maybe 500 miles per hour. You don't see your body next to you flying because both of you share the same movement of the plane. So he came and said, no. I think that a theory should be changed. And actually, it wasn't based on any sense data. Actually, sense data at the time showed us that the ball falls down. And Galileo said, no, I think we should change the theory. And actually, he was vindicated. So, one example from history, and many more from quantum physics and quantum mechanics, would show us that the idea that senses do that is mistaken, or not the complete picture. So, what's my view today? Something called against method. A lot of philosophers of science nowadays say that, and mainly importantly, Feyerabend, he's a philosopher of science, he said, science is an essentially anarchistic enterprise. Scientists who live by the rules and live by methods do not actually move science forward or do not actually move humanity. It's an anarchic enterprise. It's where people are allowed to play with method, to play with established truth, not to settle down even for scientific truths. The most important principle is called anything goes, instrumentalism. What people think that in science we're trying to find reality, we might not be doing that. We're trying to find what works for us as a species that is limited. Anything goes, it means anything you work and you establish and think about should actually apply to this rule. And we can at times advance science by counter-inductively making observations that counter known facts. So just because a theory said something, like Galileo and even Einstein, you shouldn't settle for it. And you could come with different theories, and you should play with that creatively, and this is what happens in science. So 3 important insights when we talk about science from this perspective. The importance and need of pluralism in science. Sometimes scientists can be very like a species-oriented, protective of their data, and wouldn't allow any pluralism. I think pluralism is very important, scientific pluralism, and hearing other ideas, even challenging ideas. Evaluation by science or of science by citizens. Science should be evaluated by citizens, and I agree with Feyerabend about that. Science should not be completely isolated from its impact on our social situation. That leads me to the 3rd thing about science. The need to establish a relationship between science and the happiness and the good of a society. Science, again, is not in vacuum. If it doesn't lead to the good and happiness of society, our species, then there's something wrong with it. Now I'm going to talk about evolutionary theory a little bit and neuroscience to just describe what's going on in this idea. We all know, if you believe in it or not, we are the product of evolutionary, changes through the ages. Our species is nothing but one branch of a big tree of changes and adaptation, right? Evolutionary theory was used twice in the history of science. In one instance, it was used to justify what I call a very limited view of science, and also a very superior racial view of evolution. The idea that, humans always would like to believe that they are the pinnacle of everything. Copernicus and Galileo came and said, hey, wait a minute, we're not the center of the universe. The Earth is nothing but a small, planet that rotates around the sun among thousands of other solar systems and stars. That's gone. We're not the center of everything. Now came Darwin, and Darwin said, well, we are like everybody else. We evolved like all other species. We adapted to our society. Oh, something else is gone. We're not that special. And Freud came also and said, well, wait a minute. You think you are very rational as human beings? Well, guess what? You are not. A lot of what you do is dependent on motives, on wishes and desires that you're not aware of. And these desires and wishes sometimes are very, very, troubling to us. So we're not as rational as we think. Yet even with that, people try to salvage a view of human beings as the pinnacle of everything. Why? Because it's very important, for our own sense. We look at all the species around us, we must be better than everybody. So even there's no quote-unquote God anymore in these views, evolution worked toward us. We are the pinnacle. Evolution is marching, and it improves bit by bit, and this is actually a faulty view of evolution. That we add, we change, and adapt, and every time evolution makes a better product, like an iPhone or a car. And lo and behold, we have the human beings right now who are the top of everything, They have the intelligence, that is the best evolution can offer, and reason and logic, and that's it. Kind of like we approach the ultimate things. And we are in the best position to find truth. All right. As I said, science is a product of intelligence. That's the new theory. And we know that. We know our science is based on our intelligence. But what's intelligence? People take it for granted and don't think about it. Intelligence is a product as well as an instrument of evolution. We interact with environments as any other species. And our interaction with our environment creates, about thousands of years of interactions create different modules in the brain to respond to our environment. So science is a tool for our species to allow first and foremost adaptation and understanding in the world. Science and intelligence are not in us created or evolved to discover what's out there. They evolved to help us adapt, like any other species. So, based on that, evolutionary relativism asserts, and this is based from Dr. Gonzalo Molivar's research and work, an organism's view of the world depends on its mind. That mind depends on biology. We're seeing how biology and evolutionary biology has come and to say, wait a minute, the idea that physics told us and even chemistry, that there is a truth out there waiting for us to discover, regardless of us, is actually mistaken. Our minds and brains are a product of evolution, a product of our biology, product of what we needed to evolve and to survive. Success explains truth, not the other way around. And I think that's very important. When species are looking at truth outside, they say, well, truth should be the ultimate thing, litmus test for everything. And science say, wait a minute, we never can do that because we are limited by our nervous system. Success, everything goes. Scientists chose results. It's working. That's what it is. That's the top thing. There's no need to question things about what's true out there. And I'll say about this in a second. Because as I said, our brains deceive us. Just one thing in just 2 minutes about neuroscience. Take the brain. Our brains and our conscious experiences are nothing but sometimes illusion generated by the brain. We think that we are looking at reality and we're perceiving it as it is, but brain science says no. Our brains are made by interactions of our species of thousands of years ago and our own personal history. There's a big story about if you don't show color to people, they will not know what's color because you haven't introduced them to color. It's our experience. So how does perception work in the brain? And this is really being shown by science nowadays. There are 3 things that the brain does: exaggeration and abstraction. Out of the numerous and thousands and even millions of things outside, the brain abstracts things that are important to our survival. The brain cannot take in everything, or else we will be overwhelmed and will shut down. The brain needs to amplify certain things that are important to us. Artists use this a lot. They amplify, they know that the brain will look at context and background and foreground in different ways, will allow us to perceive things that are important to us in images. Color, same things. We only see color within a certain limit in the wavelengths. I would assume, and we know that animals who don't see the same wavelengths or other species, suppose there's a species that sees different wavelengths from us. Their reality will be completely different. Their framework will be different. There's no truth out there. There is brains that constructs and predicts things. One thing that will be a good example, if there's a picture that's full of apples, and there's research about it, thousands of apples, and there's an apple missing. You know what does the brain do? It predicts that everything is apples, and the missing apple is filled with an apple. You don't see a missing thing. Same thing with our vision. We know we have what we call the blind spot, but our brains fill this out for us. So our brains are not instruments for actually creating or approximating reality. There are instruments for survival based on years and thousands of years of interaction. I want to end this I think I said and on time, by quoting two more important people that I think they have helped science more than any other people. Ferdinand is a very famous Austrian-American scientist, philosopher of science. He was also a physicist. He had a PhD in physics. He advised us, and advised scientists mainly, to have a dream world in order to achieve to discover the feature of the world we think we inhibit. That you have to dream, you have to be creative, you have to think outside the box. Einstein famously answered, what if your theory was proven wrong? And Einstein said, then I would have to be sorry for dear God, the theory is correct. You might think that Einstein is arrogant. Well, be as it is. But Einstein's theory have been vindicated, not by only observation, but theoretically speaking. And that's what I'm talking about today. We need to be open to these views of science that liberate us, that makes us think outside the box, and that opens us to actually not only experiment with other views and other points of view. You know, what I don't like, and I'm gonna end it here, is that sometimes we're dismissive of other people's views because they're not scientific. But Ferdinand tells us, no view is stupid, no view is idiotic unless we put it to the one experiment. Does it help people? Does it improve our life? And I think that's the key feature of science that I'm introducing today. Thank you, everybody.